The chamber was enormous. It floated in the cold dark between three stars, held in place by technology so old that no one remembered who had built it first. The Galactic Council had met in this place for over 40,000 years. Every seat at the great circular table was filled by a species that had crossed the stars, built empires, and survived long enough to earn a voice. There were the Veth, tall and silver-skinned, with 4 arms and eyes that could see in 17 different light spectrums. There were the Daraki, who looked like moving mountains of dark stone, so heavy that their chairs had to be reinforced with gravity dampeners. There were the Kryn, small and fast, who communicated partly in sounds and partly in color flashes from the bioluminescent patches along their necks. 43 species in total, 43 voices. And today, they had gathered for one reason: to decide what to do about the newest species to stumble into the galaxy's greater community. Humanity. Ambassador Thresh of the Veth opened the session. His voice was smooth and practiced, shaped by centuries of political work. He spoke in the common trade tongue, which the translation systems carried to every set of ears and receptor organs in the room. He said that humanity had been observed for some time now. He said that they had achieved faster-than-light travel only 60 years ago. He said that their civilization was young, disorganized, and, here he paused, letting the word carry weight, weak. The chamber stirred, not with disagreement, with agreement. The Daraki representative, Elder Kos, pressed one enormous hand flat against the table. He said that the Veth were being generous. Humanity was not merely weak. It was dangerously unstable. Their own historical records showed centuries of internal war. They had nearly destroyed their home planet several times. Their governments were divided. Their militaries were spread thin. Their technology, while showing some unusual creativity, was behind the galactic standard by at least 300 years in most categories. A small display screen rose in the center of the table. It showed a map of human-controlled space. It was not impressive. A rough sphere of perhaps 40 star systems, with trade routes that looked like a child had drawn them, and military outposts spaced in patterns that made several of the older council members actually laugh. The Kryn ambassador, whose name translated roughly as Bright Step, flashed rapid orange along her neck, the color associated with amusement, and said that whoever designed the human defensive grid had apparently never studied the concept of overlapping fields of fire. The gaps in their coverage were large enough to fly a battle group through without being detected. More laughter. Then someone brought up the incident at Proxima Station. 3 months earlier, a human cargo vessel had wandered into a region of disputed space between the Veth and a smaller species called the Merrick. The human captain, one Eva Rostova, according to the filed reports, had not turned back when hailed. She had not surrendered when threatened. She had transmitted something to both sides in the dispute, something that the translation teams had been working on for weeks. The message, once properly decoded, turned out to be a very blunt statement that she had a schedule to keep, and that if anyone fired on her ship, she would personally see to it that both their governments received a very detailed report about the illegal mining operations both of them were quietly running in the disputed zone. Then she had flown straight through. Neither side had fired. The council took a moment with that story. Several members seemed uncertain whether to find it funny or concerning. Bright Step flashed a complicated mix of colors. Elder Kos said that it was irrelevant. One bold captain did not make a species dangerous. Humans were bold, yes. Occasionally clever, yes. But boldness without strength was just noise. The vote that followed was nearly unanimous. Humanity would be classified as a Category 3 developing species. They would be observed, but not engaged. They would not be invited into the council. They would not be warned about the greater dangers of the galaxy, the dead zones, the predator species, the ancient automated weapons platforms that still drifted through certain regions of space. They would be left to figure things out on their own, or not. Most Category 3 species didn't make it. That was simply how things worked. The session was closed. The chamber lights dimmed. The representatives returned to their ships. None of them thought about humanity again for almost 2 years. The first sign that something had changed came from a Veth long-range observation post on the edge of human space. The post was automated, small, and very well hidden, a standard monitoring platform that the Veth maintained near all Category 3 species. It sent regular reports back to the Veth home system, and those reports were usually boring. Humanity building another station here. Humanity launching another colony ship there. Humanity arguing loudly with itself about resource distribution and political boundaries, as it always did. Then the reports changed. The Observer Post recorded a sudden and dramatic increase in construction activity across nearly every human shipyard simultaneously. Not civilian construction. Military. The hull profiles were unmistakable, long, reinforced, built around weapons hardpoints and engine clusters designed for sustained high-speed travel. And the numbers were not small. In a period of 8 months, humanity launched more warships than it had in the previous 20 years combined. The Veth analyst who first reviewed this data, a young researcher named Sela, flagged it immediately. She sent the report up the chain with a note that said the scale of construction was unusual and should be reviewed. Her supervisor reviewed it and sent it further up with a similar note. By the time it reached the office of Ambassador Thresh, 3 months had passed, and the construction numbers had doubled again. Thresh looked at the data for a long time. He called in his senior military advisor, a veteran of 4 interstellar conflicts whose name was Haro. Haro looked at the data for a shorter time, and then said something that Thresh had not expected him to say. He said that whoever was designing the human military buildup was not human. Or rather, whoever was designing it was not thinking like the humans the Council had observed before. The ship layouts were efficient in ways that human engineering had not previously demonstrated. The placement of jump drives relative to weapon systems showed an understanding of combat physics that took most species generations to develop. The defensive plating configurations on the new hulls were not copied from any known galactic template. They were original, and they were better than what the Veth currently used on their own warships. Thresh asked how that was possible. Haro said he didn't know, but he suggested they find out quickly. They sent a scout. The scout was a single Veth vessel, fast and cloaked, tasked with getting close enough to a human shipyard to collect detailed scans. It reached its target system without trouble. It positioned itself at a safe distance and began scanning. The data it collected confirmed everything the observation post had reported and added new details that made Haro go very quiet when he read them. The human ships were not just larger and better designed than before. They were crewed differently. The crew manifest that the scout had managed to pull from intercepted communications showed unit structures that were unfamiliar, mixed teams with specialized roles that the Veth hadn't seen before, organized in a hierarchy that was flatter than expected, but with very clear chains of command running through it. The training schedules were brutal by any standard. 16-hour sessions. Physical conditioning programs that would have hospitalized members of several softer species. And through all of it, no complaints in the intercepted messages. No protests. No requests for easier assignments. Just people doing the work. Haro brought the report to a small emergency session of Veth High Command. He stood at the front of the room and said 3 things. First, that humanity had changed in ways that the Council had not anticipated and could not currently explain. Second, that the scale of their military buildup, if continued at the current rate, would make them one of the 10 largest military forces in the known galaxy within 5 years. Third, that Veth intelligence had no idea what had caused this change or what humanity intended to do with the fleet it was building. He paused before saying the 4th thing, the thing that none of them wanted to hear. He said that 2 days ago, the scout vessel had been detected. It had been cloaked, running silent, positioned at what should have been an undetectable range. A human vessel had come alongside it, not a warship, just a patrol craft, and hailed it on the exact frequency that Veth encrypted military channels used. The human crew had not fired. They had not threatened. The message they sent was short. It said, *, we see you. We have always seen you. Come back in 6 months. We will have something to show you. *, then the patrol craft had turned and left. The scout had returned home. Ambassador Thresh sat with that message for a long time after the meeting ended. He thought about Eva Rostova flying her cargo ship through disputed space. He thought about the laughter in the council chamber. He thought about the observation post reports that had sat in administrative queues for months while his office handled what had seemed like more important things. He thought about the word always. Then he sent an urgent message to every council member he could reach, requesting an emergency session. Not all of them responded quickly. Some didn't respond at all. The Dyraki sent back a brief reply saying that humanity was a Category 3 species and that emergency sessions should be reserved for actual threats. Thresh read that reply, set it aside, and began drafting a much more detailed message. One with all the data attached. One with Haru's analysis. One with the scout's final transmission. He also began, quietly, making certain other preparations. Because he had been in politics for a very long time, and he had learned that when something surprises you once, it is called unexpected. When it surprises you twice, it is called a pattern. And patterns, in his experience, tended to arrive much faster than you were ever ready for. The emergency session of the Galactic Council was called 6 weeks later. It was not as well attended as the previous one. Several species sent lower-ranking representatives. The Dyraki Elder did not come personally, but sent a deputy who spent most of the opening remarks looking at the data on the room's central screen with an expression that slowly shifted from boredom to something harder to name. Thresh presented everything. The construction data, the crew manifests, the training records, the scout's final contact. He laid it all out without editorializing, letting the numbers and the intercepted communications do the speaking for him. When he finished, the chamber was quiet. Brightstep's bioluminescent patches were cycling through colors in a pattern that none of her staff had seen before. One of the younger Kryn aides leaned over and whispered to his colleague that he didn't know what that color combination meant. His colleague whispered back that she thought it was an old color, something their species used before their recorded history began. The old word for it, she said, translated roughly as the feeling you get when you realize the animal you were hunting has been hunting you back, the Dyraki deputy said, in a low voice that the chamber picked up and carried to every corner, that he wanted to revisit the classification. He said that Category 3 seemed wrong now. He asked what category would apply to a species that detected a cloaked Veth scout at standard observation range. No one answered immediately, because the honest answer was that no category covered it. The classification system assumed a development curve. Species followed the curve at different speeds, but they followed it. What humanity appeared to be doing was something else, something that the system had no label for. An old Merrick researcher who had come along as a technical advisor raised one of her small hands and said, carefully, that she had been studying the hull designs on the new human ships. She said that 3 of the design innovations in those hulls were things that her own people's theorists had been working on for decades without success. She said that the humans had apparently solved all 3 and done so in ways that were not just functional but elegant. She said she would very much like to know who their engineers were. Someone else said that the more important question was why. Why had humanity built this fleet? What were they planning? They were not at war with anyone. No species had threatened them openly. There was no obvious target for a military force of this scale. Thresh said that he thought they might be about to find out. Because the message from the human patrol craft had said 6 months, and 6 months was now 3 weeks away. He said that he recommended sending an official delegation. The debate that followed lasted 4 hours. Some members argued against it, that going to humanity on their terms was a sign of weakness, that it acknowledged a status humanity had not been officially granted. Others argued that not going was worse, that ignoring an explicit invitation after already being caught watching was the kind of diplomatic mistake that started wars. In the end, they voted to send a small delegation, not a full council mission, a quiet one, unofficial, just representatives from 3 or 4 species, going to listen, to look, to report back. They chose Thresh to lead it. He accepted without comment. He went back to his office and stood at the wide viewport that looked out into the dark, and he did something he had not done in a very long time. He tried, carefully and honestly, to think about what he actually knew. Not what he had assumed. Not what the classification system said. What he actually, verifiably knew. He knew that 60 years ago, humanity had been burning fossil fuels on a single planet and arguing about the shape of their borders. He knew that 40 years ago, they had barely reached their own moon with any regularity. He knew that 20 years ago, their fastest ships took 8 months to cross the distance to their nearest neighboring star. He knew that 6 months ago, a human patrol craft had found a cloaked Veth military vessel that had been specifically designed not to be found. He thought about that gap, the distance between where humanity had been and where humanity apparently was now. He measured it in his mind and found that it didn't fit, that the math didn't work. that no species developed that fast, even with help, even with external technology, even with the most favorable circumstances imaginable, unless something else was happening, something the Council hadn't considered because it hadn't seemed worth considering, unless humanity had not been developing slowly all this time, unless they had been waiting. The delegation left for human space 17 days later. For ships, representatives from the Veth, the Kryn, the Dyraki, and a small aquatic species called the Polhari who had said very little during the Council debate, but had requested, quietly and firmly, to be included. Thresh had agreed without asking why. They traveled in a loose formation, all ships broadcasting their diplomatic identification codes on open channels. No cloaks, no hidden sensor arrays. They had decided, after some discussion, to be as transparent as possible. If humanity could detect a cloaked Veth military vessel, then trying to run any covert operations would be not just futile, but insulting. And something told Thresh, in the part of his mind where instinct lived below analysis, that insulting humanity right now was not a good idea. The journey took 11 days. Human space looked different from the inside than it had in the observation reports. There was a lot more traffic. Civilian ships, yes, but organized in a way that felt less chaotic than before. And military vessels, many of them, moving in patterns that Thresh recognized as patrol routes. Not the sloppy, gap-ridden routes the Council had laughed at 2 years ago. Tight ones. Efficient ones. Routes that left no dead space. When they reached the designated meeting point, a human deep space station called Meridian Actual, they were met by an escort of 12 warships. Not a threatening escort. They held distance, maintained respectful spacing, and made no aggressive moves. But 12 was not a small number, and the ships themselves were impressive in a way that Thresh felt in his chest rather than just processed with his eyes. They were very large. They moved with a precision that suggested crews who had been doing this for a long time, which should have been impossible because these ships hadn't existed 2 years ago. A human voice came over the communication channel. It was calm and clear and direct. It said that the delegation was welcome. It said that they would be brought to the main conference facility aboard the station. It said that refreshments appropriate for each species had been prepared. That last detail made Thresh pause. Preparing species-appropriate refreshments required knowing, in detail, the biological requirements of 4 different species. The Polhari, in particular, required a carefully maintained water mixture that very few outside their home system knew how to produce correctly. Thresh mentioned this to his Polhari colleague, a round and gentle creature named Sinu who floated in a sealed water suit. Sinu made a sound that her translation unit rendered as something between surprise and satisfaction, and said that yes, she had noticed, and that the mixture in the holding tank they had provided her upon boarding was correct to within 1 part per thousand. Thresh asked if that was significant. Sinu said that the last time a foreign species had prepared her tank correctly, it had taken them 4 years and 6 attempts to get it right. Thresh filed that away. They were brought to the conference room. It was a large, clean space with good lighting calibrated for multiple species' visual ranges. A long table, chairs and alternative seating arrangements that accommodated different body types. And at the far end of the table, 3 humans. They did not look like much. They were soft-bodied, 2-armed, medium-sized. One was very old, with white hair and hands that were steady in a way that old hands usually weren't. One was younger, with dark eyes that moved constantly and a stillness to the rest of her face that Thresh associated with people who had learned to hide what they were thinking. One was middle-aged, broad-shouldered, wearing something that was not quite a military uniform, but was not quite not one either. The old one spoke first. He said his name was Director Harlan Voss. He said he was glad the Council had come. He said that humanity had been looking forward to this conversation for quite a while. Thresh said that was an interesting choice of words. He asked what Voss meant by quite a while. Voss smiled. It was a small, unhurried smile. The kind that came from someone who had prepared for this moment carefully. He said that they should probably start at the beginning. He said it was a long story, but that they had time. He looked around the table, at the representatives of the species that had watched humanity from a distance and classified them as weak, and his smile stayed exactly the same. He said, "We always had time. The beginning, as Harlan Voss told it, started not 60 years ago when humanity achieved faster-than-light travel. It started before that. Much before. It started with a question. The question had been asked by a small research team working quietly at a university on Earth's northern continent, funded by a grant so minor that no one in government had looked at it closely. The team was studying the mathematics of deep space communication, specifically, whether signals from distant civilizations could exist in the background noise of the universe that human instruments hadn't been built to detect. They found something. Not a signal from a living civilization. Something older. A compressed data structure buried in the pattern of quantum fluctuations across a broad band of space that touched Earth's solar system. It was not loud. It was not obvious. It was so quiet and so strange that the team debated for 2 years whether it was real or a measurement error. Then they built better instruments. Then they were certain. The data structure was a message. Or more accurately, it was a library. Thresh's expression did not change, but his hand, under the table, gripped the edge of his seat. The young human with the dark eyes. She introduced herself as Commander Yael Park, Strategic Intelligence, pulled up a holographic display, and showed them a visual representation of the data structure. It was vast. It was old. The decay patterns suggested it had been placed in that region of space somewhere between 800,000 and 1.2 million years ago. Thresh knew exactly what that meant. There was only one civilization in the known galaxy's recorded history that had existed 1 million years ago and then vanished entirely. Everyone called them the Founders. No one knew their real name. No one had ever found more than fragments of what they left behind. Partial ruins, broken machines, the occasional derelict vessel so degraded by time that studying it was more archaeology than engineering. Everyone had been looking for a Founder data cache for as long as the Galactic Council had existed. Humanity had been sitting on one for 40 years. The silence in the room was the kind that had weight. Voss let it sit. He was in no hurry. He picked up a cup of something warm. It smelled like a plant-based drink, simple and human, and took a slow sip and waited. Thresh asked, in a voice he was careful to keep level, how much of the library they had decoded. Park touched the display. A percentage appeared. It was not a small number. The broad-shouldered man. He introduced himself last, simply as Admiral Chun, said that the first thing they had decoded was a warning. He said the warning was about a number of things, but the most important part was a section about young civilizations and how they were typically treated by older, more established ones. He said the Founders had been very clear on this point, based on what appeared to be their own experience. He said that the warning advised any young civilization that found the library to keep quiet, develop carefully, and make absolutely certain that by the time the rest of the galaxy noticed them, they had nothing left to fear. Thresh thought about the council chamber, the laughter, the vote. Category 3. He thought about how long 40 years was. About all the work that could be done in 40 years by a species that had a million-year-old library to study and a very good reason to take the advice inside it seriously. Park brought up another display. It showed the human fleet, the full fleet, not just what the scouts had seen at the shipyards. It was significantly larger than Thresh had understood. The numbers moved through his mind and did not land anywhere comfortable. Chen said, calmly, that humanity had not built this fleet because it wanted a war. He said that humanity was not interested in conquest or domination or reshaping the political structure of the galaxy. He said, in a voice that was very quiet and very clear, that humanity had built this fleet because the Founders' library had described, in considerable detail, what happened to species that couldn't defend themselves when they were finally noticed. He said that humanity had decided, collectively, that they would not be that species. Thresh looked across the table at the 3 humans. He looked at the old man with the steady hands, and the woman with the guarded eyes, and the admiral who had said nothing aggressive but somehow filled the room. He thought about the patrol craft that had found his cloaked scout. He thought about Sunu's tank, prepared correctly on the first try. He thought about the message, *We see you. We have always seen you. He asked Voss how long humanity had known about the Galactic Council's observation programs. Voss set down his cup. He said, since the 2nd year. What followed in that conference room over the next 3 days was not a negotiation. It was not a confrontation. It was something that the Galactic Council had not conducted in a very long time. An honest conversation between equals. Humanity's terms were not aggressive. They were not punitive. They did not demand territory or resources or political concessions. They asked for 4 things. First, full membership in the Galactic Council, with all voting rights and access to shared intelligence that membership entitled them to. Second, the right to maintain their military at current strength without interference or inspection, in the same way that all other council members maintained their own militaries. Third, access to the dead zone maps and the locations of the ancient automated weapons platforms, because several human exploration vessels had come uncomfortably close to those hazards already in the Founders' Library, while detailed on many things, had maps that were a million years out of date. Fourth, and this was the one that made the room go very still, a formal apology from the council. Not a diplomatic apology, a real one. Recorded, official, entered into the permanent record. Thresh asked what the apology was for. Voss said for the laughter. He said he didn't mean that personally. He said that humans understood that the council had not known, that the classification system was old and usually functional, that the decision not to warn humanity about galactic dangers was made without malice, just with the same comfortable assumptions that all powerful organizations tended to make about those they considered small. He said the apology was not about punishing the council. It was about establishing, from the very beginning of this new relationship, that humanity was not and had never been small, and that the record should reflect that the council, upon full review of the facts, agreed. He said that if the council could not agree to that, humanity had no interest in joining it, that they would remain outside, self-sufficient, and that future interactions would be conducted strictly on a case-by-case basis, through formal diplomatic channels, at humanity's discretion. He said it pleasantly, the way a person says something they have already fully accepted the consequences of. Thresh sat with that for a while. He looked at his Kryn colleague, whose color patches were cycling slowly through something that she said. When he looked at her, felt like respect. He looked at the Dothraki deputy, who was staring at the fleet numbers still floating in the holographic display, and who said nothing, but who nodded, once, slowly. He looked at Sunu, floating gently in her suit, who said, in her bubbling translated voice, that she had always thought the Category 3 designation was imprecise. Thresh turned back to Harlan Voss. He said that he would need to consult with the full council. Voss said of course. He said they had already prepared a communication facility for the delegation's use, with encryption protocols compatible with Veth military channels. He said they would wait as long as needed. He said that humanity was patient. The council debate lasted 9 hours. Thresh participated by remote link, watching faces on screens instead of across a table, listening to arguments that ranged from furious to fascinated. The Dothraki elder, who had now seen the fleet numbers himself, said very little. When he did speak, he said that the apology was a small price. He said that having humanity inside the council, where they could be talked to and worked with, was considerably better than having them outside it. The vote was not unanimous. 7 species voted against, mostly on the grounds of precedent, that changing category status based on military capacity would have implications for how other species were classified. 3 abstained. 33 voted in favor. Thresh relayed the result to Voss personally. Voss received it with the same calm he had shown throughout. He thanked Thresh. He said that humanity looked forward to contributing to the council's work. He said that the Founders' Library contained sections that were relevant to several ongoing problems the council had been working on for decades, and that humanity was willing to share those sections as a gesture of good faith. Then he said one more thing. He said that humanity bore no grudge. He said that was important to understand. He said that his people had been angry in the early years when they first understood how they were being watched and classified and dismissed. But that anger had been useful. It had driven the work, sharpened the focus, made the long years of preparation feel purposeful. Now the preparation was finished. The work was done. The anger had burned itself clean, and what was left was simply a species ready to be part of something larger. He said that he hoped the council felt the same. Thresh said, honestly, that he thought they were getting there. Voss smiled, the same small, unhurried smile, and extended his hand across the table in the human gesture that Thresh had read about but never received before. Thresh reached out and took it. Outside the station's wide viewports, the human fleet held its formation in the dark, patient and still, engine lights steady as stars. The delegation ships floated among them without fear. The stars turned slowly above and below, indifferent and ancient, shining on a meeting that would be recorded in council history as the moment everything changed. Not because of the ships, not because of the library or the fleet or the numbers on any screen. Because two people had sat across a table, and one of them had told the truth about what had been done, and the other had reached across the space between them and said, "Let's start from here," and they had.